Flight attendants removed a black boy from first class for not belonging there. Seconds later, they learned his father owned the plane, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He blew a whistle into a baby's face, laughing as the child woke up screaming in terror. Subscribe if you believe no cruelty disguised as a joke should ever be excused. He doesn't belong here. The words were a low whisper, sharp as a paper cut, barely audible over the soft chime that signaled the cabin doors had been sealed. But Ethan Calder heard them. His ears, though young, had been trained over years of quiet dinners with powerful men who underestimated what silence could absorb. The 12-year-old didn't flinch. Instead, he sat a little straighter in seat 1A, his back against the cream leather headrest, hands neatly folded in his lap. Blake Soren, the young flight attendant with a perfectly groomed part and a badge that gleamed too proudly under the overhead light, didn't bother to mask his disdain. His eyes, narrow and calculating, fixed on Ethan with quiet contempt. Dressed in his airline's dark gray uniform, Blake leaned subtly toward his colleague, a man named Drew who was organizing welcome drinks near the galley. With a quick flick of his chin, Blake nodded toward the boy. "He doesn't belong here," he said again, this time with more certainty. Drew glanced over, briefly puzzled before following Blake's gaze. When he saw the boy in the front row window seat, alone, dignified, wearing a navy blue suit that didn't quite fit, his lips tightened into a small line of disapproval. Neither attendant noticed the man seated beside the boy, his presence unassuming yet purposeful. Cyrus Alton, known across the aviation world as the founder and CEO of Alton Aerodyne, was cloaked in anonymity by design. He wore a charcoal blazer and wire-framed glasses, reading a folded copy of the Ralden Tribune with the idle air of a businessman lost in thought. But his mind was anything but idle. Cyrus had orchestrated this flight like a test. Solanair Flight 417, a luxury charter jet connecting the financial hub of Ralden to the coastal sprawl of Newcrest City, had been randomly selected. He wanted to witness firsthand how contracted airline crews treated first-class passengers when no one was watching. He had chosen to bring Ethan along under a false identity, not for protection, but for perspective. To the crew, they were just another father and son, nothing more. As the engines hummed to life beneath them and the cabin lights dimmed into a warm, golden glow, Blake approached with practiced poise. He crouched slightly beside Ethan's seat, assuming a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey there, buddy," he said, voice lined with the kind of forced kindness reserved for small children lost in grocery stores. "I think you might be in the wrong section. Let's get you back to where you belong, okay?" Ethan blinked up at him, calm but confused. "My seat is 1A, sir." Blake's smile twitched. He glanced quickly at Drew, who now hovered just behind him with a half-raised brow. "I'm sure it's just a little mix-up," Blake said, shifting his weight as he offered a hand. "Why don't we go find your real seat, yeah?" The moment hung between them, still and charged. From behind the newspaper, Cyrus spoke without lowering the page. "He's fine where he is." Blake turned his head sharply, startled. "Sir, this section is reserved for first-class passengers," he said, trying to keep his tone professional but firm. "We can't just allow anyone to—" "Anyone?" Cyrus lowered the paper then, folding it precisely before resting it on the side table. His eyes met Blake's, calm and unreadable. The word lingered in the air like a challenge, quiet but undeniable. The implication behind it hit Blake with an unexpected sting, but his pride surged to the front like a defense mechanism. "I'm just following procedure," Blake replied stiffly. "We have policies to uphold." Drew leaned closer, muttering something that made Blake smirk faintly. Whatever the whisper was, it was enough to embolden him further. "We have to maintain standards," Blake said more loudly, glancing around to see if the nearby passengers were watching. A few were. One older man in seat 2C gave a disapproving glance but said nothing. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, the smooth armrest cool under his palms. The silver pin on his lapel, engraved with the initials CA, caught the low light of the cabin. A gift from his father, the pin reminded him of the legacy he hadn't asked to inherit but quietly respected. He could feel the air changing around him, tension building like invisible storm clouds in a clear sky. Cyrus remained still. His gaze didn't waver from Blake's face. He could have revealed his identity then and there, could have silenced the arrogance with a single word. But that wasn't the point. This was the point. "I said, he's fine where he is," he repeated, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. Blake bristled. "Sir, this seat is for premium passengers. We'll need to verify his ticket." "You're welcome to check," Cyrus said simply, leaning back. Ethan, sensing the eyes of the entire cabin now upon him, quietly opened the leather folio beside him and retrieved the boarding pass. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the pressure of being watched. He handed the slip of paper to Blake. The attendant took it without gratitude, scanning it quickly. His eyes stopped at one line. "Priority Owner Class." The blood drained from his face, but instead of apologizing, Blake forced a laugh as if he'd discovered some amusing clerical error. "This must be a mistake," he said, waving the pass lightly. "No child holds this kind of ticket." Someone must have entered the wrong data at the desk. Drew's posture tensed behind him. The cabin seemed to still again. Cyrus didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend. He just watched. Blake, now eager to control the narrative, turned toward the aisle. "Come on, kid," he said. "Let's go before this gets embarrassing." Ethan looked at his father. Cyrus gave no command, no protest, just a slow, deliberate nod that said more than words ever could. There was no fear in his expression, only patience, measured, waiting, dangerous patience. The engines roared gently beneath them as the aircraft lifted into the sky, carrying 143 passengers and crew into the clouds, and with them, an unfolding judgment no one had seen coming. "Let's see how they behave when they think no one's watching." Blake Soren crouched beside seat 1A with the exaggerated politeness of someone putting on a performance rather than offering help. His smile was too tight, his eyes too sharp. Passengers around the cabin sensed something in the air, a shift from routine to tension. "Hey, buddy," Blake said, tilting his head as if speaking to a lost child. "I think you're in the wrong section. Let's get you back to your proper seat, okay?" Ethan Calder looked up, startled but polite. His soft brown eyes blinked slowly as if replaying the sentence in his head. "My seat is 1A, sir," he replied calmly, his voice quiet but clear. Blake's smile didn't falter, but the corners of his mouth twitched with irritation. "I'm sure it's just a little mix-up," he said with a chuckle that wasn't friendly. "Why don't you let me help you find where you really belong?" He reached out as though ready to guide the boy away. His fingers hovered near Ethan's shoulder, not quite touching, but close enough to make the boy flinch slightly. Before Ethan could speak again, a page of newspaper rustled nearby. Cyrus Alton lowered it slowly, revealing only his eyes at first. Calm, focused, unreadable. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "He's fine where he is." Blake turned toward the man seated beside the boy, briefly confused by the interruption. The tone had stopped him, not the words. It was too steady, too controlled. But Blake recovered quickly, dismissing the interruption with forced courtesy. "Sir, this section is reserved for first-class passengers," he explained as if reciting a policy manual. "We can't just allow anyone to—" Cyrus lowered the paper fully now and locked eyes with him. "Anyone?" The single word echoed, soft but deliberate, hanging in the air like a warning. Blake blinked, caught off guard by the challenge, but instead of backing down, he straightened his back and puffed his chest slightly. "Yes, sir," he said, choosing to misunderstand the implication. "We've had incidents in the past. Passengers sneaking up here. Company policy is strict about seat verification." From behind the curtain separating the galley from the cabin, another attendant emerged. Drew Hanley, a tall man with neatly combed hair and a clipboard in hand, approached quietly. He leaned toward Blake and whispered something. Whatever he said made Blake smirk. Passengers in nearby seats, sensing the escalating tension, began paying attention. A few angled their phones subtly, pretending to scroll or read, but their cameras were rolling. The air grew thicker, not with altitude, but with judgment. Cyrus hadn't moved. His posture remained composed, his expression unreadable, but his presence was suddenly unmistakable. Ethan sat rigid in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests tightly, knuckles pale. He glanced at his father, but Cyrus didn't return the look. His attention remained on the two attendants. Blake gestured to Drew with a small nod. "It's just policy," he said, now more loudly, as if speaking to the entire cabin. "We'll need to move the child to his correct seat." He stepped forward, reaching once more. Cyrus's hand lifted, palm open, not aggressive, but immovable. "Don't touch my son." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They cut through the quiet murmurs of the cabin like a gust through still air. Blake froze, his hand inches away from Ethan's shoulder. Drew shifted uncomfortably, suddenly less certain of the situation. "Maybe we should confirm with the captain," he muttered under his breath. Blake ignored him. His jaw tightened. "Sir, I don't care who you are. This boy cannot stay here without proper clearance." Ethan reached slowly into the small leather satchel at his feet and pulled out a neatly folded boarding pass. His fingers trembled slightly, but his voice didn't waver. "I have a ticket." He handed it to Blake. Blake snatched it more aggressively than necessary, eyes scanning the text. As he read the words, "Priority Owner Class, Seat 1A, his expression shifted from smug to confused, then to dismissive disbelief. "This must be a printing error," he said with a forced laugh. "No child holds this kind of ticket." From behind the seats, someone whispered, "That's his dad next to him." The murmur wasn't loud, but it caught Drew's attention. He looked again at Cyrus, longer this time, more carefully. Cyrus didn't flinch. He didn't explain. He didn't protest. He simply watched. Blake cleared his throat. "Come on, kid. Let's go before this gets embarrassing." Ethan didn't move. He looked at his father again. Cyrus gave no signal, just silence. Blake reached out a final time, and that's when Cyrus spoke again, his voice lower now, almost reflective. His gaze never left Blake's face. His words carried not just authority, but warning. "Policies reveal character," he murmured. Blake's hand hovered just inches above the boy's shoulder, his fingers twitching with impatience. But before he could make contact, a voice, low and controlled, sliced through the charged silence. "Don't touch my son." The words struck with a force that seemed to ripple through the cabin. A hush fell over the nearby passengers, heads subtly turning as though drawn by invisible strings. Blake froze, his hand suspended midair, his expression faltering as he slowly turned toward the source. Cyrus Alton sat still in his seat, his eyes fixed on the attendant with the steadiness of a man used to commanding rooms without ever raising his voice. Blake blinked, momentarily disoriented. He had pegged the man in the blazer and open collar as some mid-level executive, traveling with his ward, nothing to raise alarms about. But the steel in Cyrus's tone hinted at authority far beyond appearances. Still, Blake pushed down the flicker of unease tightening in his gut. He straightened, exhaling sharply through his nose. "Sir," he said, voice clipped, "I don't care who you are. This boy cannot stay here without proper clearance." Ethan flinched at the words. He hadn't moved since Blake approached, still sitting upright in the plush leather seat, his small hands gripping the armrests like they were anchors. His brown eyes darted from Blake to his father, then back again, but his voice, though shaken, emerged steady. "I have a ticket." Reaching into his lap, Ethan opened the small leather case nestled beside him. Inside was a carefully folded boarding pass, crisp and clean, bearing the unmistakable seal of Solanair's priority owner class. With quiet dignity, the boy extended it upward. Blake snatched it, barely glancing at the trembling hand. He scanned the print with quick, dismissive eyes. Then his brows furrowed. The words stared back at him in bold type. Priority Owner Class. Ethan Calder. A shadow of confusion crossed his face, then twisted into disbelief. For a moment he said nothing, staring at the pass as though it were written in a foreign language. This. Blake chuckled nervously, holding the pass up as if inspecting a forgery. This must be a printing error. No child holds this kind of ticket. He shook his head, laughing again to himself, a brittle sound that failed to hide the anxiety creeping into his posture. His eyes darted toward Drew, who stood a few feet behind, arms crossed, clearly unsure whether to intervene or back away. Cyrus didn't speak. He didn't need to. The intensity in his gaze had not wavered, not even as Blake continued to unravel in front of him. The silence between them stretched taut, sharp as a wire. "Come on, kid," Blake finally said, gesturing toward the aisle. "Let's go before this gets embarrassing." The words were casual, but his voice had lost its earlier bite. He was sweating now, the underarms of his uniform beginning to stain. A few rows back, a man cleared his throat loudly, but Blake ignored it, eyes fixed on Ethan like this moment was his last chance to assert control. Ethan hesitated. He didn't rise, not immediately. He looked up at his father, eyes wide, searching. Cyrus hadn't moved. He sat with one leg crossed, his hands neatly folded over his lap, the picture of composure. Yet his silence was thunderous. Blake stepped closer, his shadow now falling over the boy. "Come on," he said again, more firmly. Still, Cyrus did not stop him, nor did he blink. Drew stepped forward slightly, whispering just loud enough to be heard. "Should we check with the captain?" Blake shot him a look, his pride clearly outweighing his caution. "No," he hissed. "We'll handle this ourselves." The plane's engines hummed steadily beneath their feet, indifferent to the quiet drama playing out above. A muffled announcement from the cockpit buzzed through the intercom, routine and unrelated. The flight was progressing without delay, except in this pocket of tension growing louder with every second of silence. Ethan slowly stood, his navy blazer bunching at the sleeves. He picked up his case and stepped into the aisle, his back straight but his face clouded with uncertainty. The silence in the cabin deepened. Even those pretending not to listen were now watching with held breath. As Ethan turned to follow Blake down the aisle, Cyrus finally spoke. His voice, though soft, carried with haunting clarity. "Sometimes," he said, "the best test of leadership is silence before the storm." Blake Soren stood rigid beside seat 1A, his jaw tight and eyes narrowed, as if the boy sitting there had disrupted the entire balance of first class. Beside him, Drew Hanley hovered uncertainly, glancing nervously at the passengers who had begun to shift in their seats. The cabin lights hummed softly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the luxury leather seats and polished fixtures, but the tension in the air felt anything but calm. "Come on," Blake said with forced politeness, his voice low but insistent. "Let's not make this difficult." He crouched slightly and reached toward Ethan's shoulder, fingers hovering inches away. Ethan Calder, dressed in a suit a touch too large, sat with quiet composure, his hands neatly folded on his lap. His eyes, wide and calm, lifted to meet Blake's, searching for some explanation. "My seat is 1A, he said again, his voice steady despite the tremble beneath it. Blake didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Drew with a tight whisper. "We'll look weak if we back off now." Drew hesitated. "He's with that man in 1B, right? They seem related. If we don't act, we'll look like we're showing favoritism," Drew murmured, unsure. "I'd rather risk that than let someone mock first class," Blake replied, his words sharp and decisive. He straightened his posture and gave Ethan a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then, without waiting for permission, he lightly gripped the boy's arm and gave a gentle but unmistakable tug. A ripple passed through the cabin. In seat 1C, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses muttered under his breath, "He's clearly traveling with his father." "What's wrong with you people?" The whisper wasn't loud, but it carried. A few passengers turned their heads, curious now, some already raising their phones discreetly, recording from behind armrests and headrests. The tension had shifted, no longer just an isolated misunderstanding. It was becoming something larger, something uncomfortable. Still, Blake pressed forward. "Let's go, son," he said, trying to sound gentle, but his tone betrayed the impatience beneath it. Ethan slowly stood, his legs stiff, dignity wrapped tightly around his small frame like armor. His gaze remained fixed forward. He didn't cry, he didn't plead, but his lips were pressed tightly together, and his small fingers clenched the edge of his suit jacket as if holding on to something invisible yet vital. Cyrus Alton hadn't moved until now. With deliberate grace, he folded his newspaper and set it aside, then stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. Yet the moment he rose, the air in the cabin shifted entirely. His height added weight to his presence, but it was his composure that drew the silence. Even Blake, for all his bravado, took a half step back. "You're making a serious mistake," Cyrus said, his voice level and calm, but beneath it was something unyielding, like steel hidden beneath silk. Blake turned to face him. "Sir, the only mistake here is letting rules slide for people who don't fit the picture." The words hung there, heavy, wrong. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Passengers who had previously ignored the confrontation now sat fully upright, brows furrowed, cameras lifted. Even Drew looked stunned by the phrasing, his lips parting slightly as if to object, but he said nothing. Cyrus's gaze didn't shift. He didn't argue. He didn't raise a hand. He only watched. Watched as they turned away from him and led his son down the narrow aisle toward the dividing curtain. Watched as passengers whispered and phones recorded and judgment crackled silently in the cabin air like distant thunder before a storm. Ethan walked without resistance, though each step felt like a slow erosion of dignity. As he reached the curtain, he paused, as if sensing something behind him. Slowly, he turned. Cyrus hadn't moved. His arms were folded now, eyes locked on his son, piercing, unreadable, calm. And then he spoke again, softly, so softly only those nearby heard it. "Very well," he said, his voice more like a verdict than a statement. "Let's see how far you take this." Ethan held his father's gaze for one final moment, no fear, only trust, then disappeared behind the curtain. Cyrus remained still. Around him, the plane buzzed with quiet speculation, but he was unmoved. There was no fury in his eyes, only calculation. As the curtain swayed shut behind his son, his lips moved once more, barely above a whisper. "Some lessons," he murmured, "must unfold in full." Ethan sank into the narrow seat near the rear lavatory, the scent of antiseptic and engine fuel filling his nostrils. The armrest was sticky, the cushion threadbare, and the air noticeably warmer than the climate-controlled front of the cabin. Around him, a few passengers looked on with confusion and discomfort, whispering among themselves, their faces shifting between sympathy and unease. A man in a gray business jacket leaned toward the aisle, his voice low but firm. "That boy was in first class." "I saw him with the man in 1B, he said to the approaching flight attendant. Blake didn't even glance at him. "Please remain seated, sir," he replied sharply, his jaw tightening as he brushed past. With a final stern look at the gathering murmurs, Blake raised one hand as if drawing an invisible boundary. The message was clear. No interference. Ethan sat upright, his small hands folded in his lap, clutching the edges of his boarding pass like a tether. He did not cry. He did not protest. But inside, a storm of quiet confusion brewed. Every word his father had ever spoken about integrity, posture, and restraint rang in his ears. Always carry yourself with dignity, even when others try to take it from you. Behind the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the cabin, Cyrus Alton had not moved. He sat like a statue, still holding his newspaper, his face unreadable. To anyone watching, he was just another businessman on a flight, unmoved by the minor incident involving a misplaced child. But beneath the surface, his mind was calculating, observing, and remembering. Drew Hanley, sweating lightly beneath his collar, leaned into the phone in the crew station. "Captain," he said, trying to keep his voice even, "we have an unauthorized child who is seated in first class. We've moved him to the back, per policy." The captain's response crackled back with casual detachment. "Copy that. If it's handled, I trust your judgment. Judgment." The word echoed through the cabin like a forgotten bell. Cyrus tapped the face of his watch twice. A soft vibration buzzed against his wrist, confirming that recording had begun. Tiny cameras embedded in the seat backs, overhead panels, and even inside the lavatories, part of Alton Aerodyne's covert behavioral assessment program, had been streaming since takeoff. But now, the footage was being flagged, copied, and encrypted. In seat 3D, a man in a tan blazer shifted his gaze toward Cyrus. His name was Miles, the CEO's assistant, assigned to shadow him discreetly for this evaluation. Without speaking, Miles tilted his head slightly, a silent question in his eyes. "Sir," he whispered just loud enough to carry over the gentle whir of the engines, "do we intervene?" Cyrus didn't look away from the paper. His voice was so calm it felt colder than ice. "No. Let them write their own consequences." Back near the lavatory, Ethan turned his face toward the window. There was nothing but cloud cover beyond the thick glass, endless and gray. The roar of the engines pulsed through the metal frame of the plane like a heartbeat. He tried not to look at the nearby lavatory door, or at the pair of shoes tapping impatiently next to it, or at the man clearing his throat every few seconds. It was not a place for children, and it certainly wasn't the place for the son of Cyrus Alton. But Ethan didn't speak. He didn't need to. He understood the lesson wasn't just for the flight attendants. Blake leaned back against the crew station, sipping water with smug satisfaction. "You see," he muttered to Drew, "this is why you don't let appearances fool you. First class is earned, not borrowed." Drew chuckled, though uneasily. "Still, he had a boarding pass, right?" Blake shrugged. "Kids like that get lucky. Doesn't mean we let them make a joke out of the front row. Someone has to uphold the standard. Nearby passengers caught fragments of their conversation, shifting in their seats, uncomfortable with the tone but unwilling to speak up again. A young man in his 20s reached for his phone and angled it subtly toward the attendants, quietly recording. In first class, Cyrus slowly folded the newspaper and set it on the tray in front of him. He adjusted his cufflinks, brushed an invisible wrinkle from his slacks, and inhaled deeply. His son had been humiliated. His company's aircraft had become the stage for a test, and the results were damning. The seat's armrest vibrated slightly. A message from internal compliance had just come through. Live transmission confirmed. Server synchronization active. The behavioral monitoring team back at headquarters was watching now. Every word, every motion, every smirk captured in crystal clarity. Cyrus leaned back and exhaled slowly, his gaze distant, yet focused. "They've chosen arrogance over decency," he whispered. Miles, watching from behind, met his eyes with a silent nod. Blake strutted down the aisle, glancing at passengers like a performer finishing a scene, unaware that the curtains had already been drawn back and the audience was far larger than he imagined. He walked right past Ethan, who remained still, unmoving. The boy's calm face betrayed nothing of the weight he carried, of who he was, or who was watching. The engines roared beneath them, steady and powerful, as the clouds gave way to blue sky and the plane gently tilted to the east. On board were not just travelers and crew, but decisions, judgments, and reputations still unaware of the gravity pressing down upon them. "This flight," Cyrus said quietly, "will never be forgotten." The drink cart rattled slightly as the plane dipped through a patch of light turbulence. In the rear section near the lavatories, 12-year-old Ethan Calder sat quietly, his small frame dwarfed by the aging seat that had clearly seen better days. The stale scent of recycled air and faint traces of cleaning chemicals lingered around him. The overhead lights flickered once before stabilizing, casting a dull yellow glow on the cramped space he now occupied, a stark contrast to the wide, polished elegance of first class where he had started this journey. Blake Sorn and Drew Hanley moved down the aisle with forced efficiency, their expressions painted with smug satisfaction. As Blake passed Ethan's row, he didn't look down. Instead, he whispered to Drew, just loud enough for nearby passengers to overhear. "You can't just let anyone sit up front because they look confident," Blake said, a crooked smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Some people need to be reminded of their place." Drew offered a nervous chuckle, clearly uneasy. His eyes darted quickly around the cabin, noting the furrowed brows and disapproving glances of passengers who had quietly witnessed the earlier altercation. But Blake didn't care. His confidence, bloated by pride, made him blind to the discontent forming in the silence. Ethan heard the words, every one of them. He didn't flinch. Instead, he kept his posture straight, hands folded over a small leather-bound notebook resting in his lap. His fingers clenched the cover for a moment, then loosened. His father's voice echoed in his mind like a steady compass. "Integrity doesn't depend on the seat you're in." Across the cabin, unseen by the crew, a camera nestled in the corner above the galley blinked softly, its lens fixed on the aisle. Another camera, embedded behind the cabin panel near the lavatory light, captured the expression on Blake's face as he passed Ethan. And a third, almost invisible to the human eye, recorded the moment Drew turned to glance at the boy, his expression caught between guilt and silent compliance. Miles, seated incognito in 4B, watched his discreet monitor embedded in a sleek tablet, face blank but jaw tight. Every second of footage streamed directly to the internal compliance servers of Alton Aerodyne. There, a dedicated monitoring team stationed hundreds of miles away sat stunned as they watched the events unfold in real time. Inside the control room, a senior analyst leaned forward, muttering to his colleague, "Is that the CEO's son?" The answer came not in words, but in the quiet disbelief that filled the room. Back on the plane, Cyrus Alton sat in 1B, his demeanor as composed as ever. He appeared to be reading a newspaper, one hand flipping the pages every now and then. But his mind was elsewhere, calculating, recording, and remembering. He had not moved since Ethan was escorted away. Not once had he raised his voice or made a scene. Power, he believed, did not require volume. It required precision. As the plane leveled again, Blake returned to the front, exchanging brief remarks with Drew. "I think we handled that well," Blake said smugly. "You just have to be firm. Otherwise, people walk all over you." Drew didn't respond. His eyes lingered on the cabin curtain that separated them from the section where Ethan now sat alone. Something about the boy's quiet dignity unsettled him. "Come on," Blake said, noticing his hesitation. "You saw the way he looked at us, like he belonged here or something. Trust me, once we land, no one will even remember this." But someone was remembering. Every word, every look, every action. And the quiet was not silence. It was observation. Ethan shifted slightly, pulling out a pen from his pocket and beginning to scribble in his notebook. He wasn't writing about revenge or anger. He was writing what he saw, what he felt, documenting the truth in a way no camera could capture. His eyes wandered to the window, the clouds stretching out like an endless sea. Despite the humiliation, there was calm in his expression, an inner clarity that came from knowing who he was and what he stood for. Behind him, a soft beep from a control panel near the galley went unnoticed. The system had marked a behavioral flag, one of many, triggered by verbal bias and unauthorized removal of a ticketed passenger. The algorithm assigned to monitor crew behavior was quietly building a profile, compiling timestamps, and preparing a full incident summary for executive review. Blake returned to his duties, now handing out warm towels with a renewed air of superiority. Each smile he gave to passengers seemed practiced, hollow. He passed by seat 1C, where a middle-aged man offered nothing but a cold stare in return. "I saw what you did," the man murmured when Blake leaned closer. Blake blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said," the man repeated, more clearly this time, "I saw what you did to that boy." And so did everyone else. Blake straightened, color rising in his cheeks, but he quickly walked away, brushing off the comment like lint from a blazer. He had no idea how true those words were. Back in first class, Cyrus finally folded his newspaper and laid it aside. The engines hummed beneath the floor like a distant warning. His fingers moved to the dial of his watch, tapping it twice. Instantly, the feed transmitted by Miles locked onto the CEO's secure channel, syncing with onboard archival data. He leaned back, expression unreadable. From behind darkened lenses, his eyes flicked once toward the aisle, the very one his son had been forced to walk in humiliation. In his mind, there were no more decisions to weigh, no more observations to make. The crew had written their own report with every action, every word, every failure of basic decency. The curtain swayed gently in the air-conditioned breeze as Blake passed through once more, unaware that he was now a case study in arrogance and, soon, in consequence. Miles looked down at his screen, watching the final clips being tagged by the compliance system. His voice, low and even, came through the earpiece. "Sir, all footage is secure. Transmission complete. Cyrus didn't turn. He simply responded, 'Good.'" Let them finish the flight unaware. Miles nodded once. "Understood." As the cabin settled into an artificial quiet with soft music piping through the overhead speakers, a sense of unease took root, not with the crew, but with those watching silently. The passengers, the monitors, the boy with the notebook. And still, Blake smiled to himself, unaware that each gesture, each phrase had been captured from 3 different angles, not just by lenses, but by truth. Cyrus closed his eyes for a moment, then whispered under his breath. "Arrogance," he thought, "is the first turbulence of downfall." "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice broke through the cabin intercom, his words cutting through the quiet hum of the aircraft. "We'd like to welcome a very special passenger aboard today, though we were not informed in advance." The tone was unusual, measured, but clearly unsettled, like a man reading a message he didn't fully understand yet. Heads lifted. Passengers looked up from books, tablets, and drinks, exchanging puzzled glances. In first class, Blake Soren stiffened. He glanced toward his fellow attendant, Drew Hanley, whose brow furrowed with uncertainty. "Did you request a VIP announcement?" Drew whispered, his voice tight with confusion. Blake shook his head slowly, eyes narrowing. "No," he said. "We weren't briefed on anyone special." "This isn't protocol." The captain's voice returned, slightly firmer now, as though having received a sudden push from someone behind the scenes. "We've just received communication from Alton Aerodyne's Central Operations. The owner of this aircraft and this airline's largest shareholder is on board." A sharp silence fell across the cabin, thick and immediate. It was the kind of silence that made every small movement feel amplified. The clink of a spoon on porcelain, the rustle of a seatbelt strap, the quiet hush of collective breath being held. Blake felt the blood drain from his face. He instinctively turned toward the front, and his gaze landed on the tall, composed figure of the man seated in 1B. The man had risen from his seat and was buttoning his blazer with deliberate precision. Something about the movement, the quiet confidence, the absence of surprise, sent a chill through Blake's spine. It was then that the captain delivered the final blow. "We would like to extend gratitude to Mr. Cyrus Alton, founder and CEO of Alton Airline." Drew let out an audible gasp. Blake staggered back a step. Cyrus Alton. The name fell like thunder. The same man Blake had dismissed as a meddlesome traveler. The man whose son he had physically escorted out of first class. The man who had said nothing, watched everything, and let their arrogance unfold. Cyrus took a slow step forward into the aisle, his presence suddenly undeniable. His calm eyes scanned the faces around him, passengers frozen mid-sentence, attendants standing rigid, a few filming discreetly with their phones. He adjusted his cufflinks, his voice unwavering. "Return my son to his rightful seat," he said. The command was quiet, but it rang through the cabin like a bell. Blake opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat tightened and his hands twitched at his sides, unsure whether to salute or retreat. Drew, pale and breathless, reached for his radio but fumbled it against the seat's edge. Cyrus's gaze held steady. Not angry, not loud, just firm, with the kind of weight that made it impossible to pretend anymore. Ethan, miles away in the rear of the plane, seated beside a lavatory with no window, remained unaware of the shift unfolding up front. But the cabin around Cyrus had already transformed. Respect, fear, and shame now hung in the air like electricity before a storm. I didn't know, sir," Blake finally stammered, each word cracking under the pressure of reality. Cyrus didn't blink. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat a child with respect." He turned to Drew, then to the cabin supervisor who had just stepped out from the galley, alerted by the commotion. All three stood frozen in guilt and realization. Then, quietly, Cyrus added the words that chilled the bones of every man in uniform. "And bring every manager responsible for this behavior to my office upon landing." The cabin erupted in murmurs the instant the captain's announcement ended, as though someone had ripped the seal off a pressurized silence. Dozens of passengers instinctively reached for their phones, some pretending to scroll, others blatantly recording. The subtle clicks of cameras and the blinking red lights of active video feeds dotted the air like a constellation of judgment. A sense of realization was sweeping across the rows, like a gust that had suddenly lifted a curtain. Blake Soren stood frozen mid-step, his hand twitching by his side. He looked like someone who had just misread a street sign moments before a crash. His voice, once smug and firm, had lost all foundation. "Sir, I didn't know," he stammered, eyes darting toward the cockpit as if searching for a lifeline. Cyrus Alton didn't flinch. His tone didn't rise, but it cut deeper than any shout. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat a child with respect." His words fell heavy, final. No one spoke. Even the hum of the engine seemed to retreat beneath the weight of what had been said. The color drained from Blake's face as his mouth opened slightly, then closed again. The confidence that had once gleamed in his eyes now shattered into confusion and dread. Across the cabin, Ethan stood. He didn't need prompting. His movements were quiet, unhurried, graceful in their restraint. The attendants instinctively moved to guide him back, but Cyrus raised one hand, fingers slightly curled, palm outward. "No," he said, steady and cold. "He'll walk on his own." The words echoed louder than they should have. It wasn't just a rejection of their help, it was a declaration, a message, a reminder that dignity couldn't be returned with a gesture after being stripped by arrogance. Ethan's feet moved forward with purpose, his small figure threading through the narrow aisle. His posture was upright, his steps firm, and his gaze forward, not defiant, but sure. The boy had learned something in those minutes away from his father's side, and now every passenger bore witness to it. Passengers whispered to each other in hushed tones. "That's his son? The CEO." They humiliated him. Ethan reached his original seat, and as he eased into it, he looked at his father with a mixture of quiet relief and deep respect. "Thank you, Father," he said softly. Cyrus offered only a faint nod, but his eyes remained locked on the attendants like an anchor holding them in place. There was no warmth in his expression, no forgiveness in his stance, only the stillness of measured power, the calm before a far larger reckoning. From the cockpit, the captain, Captain Harrow, emerged. He was a tall man in his late 40s, shoulders squared, expression marked with confusion and guilt. His hat was clutched tightly in one hand, the other tucked stiffly behind his back. "Mr. Alton," he began, voice low, "on behalf of—" Cyrus cut him off without even looking. "Save your words for the report you'll file," he said, not unkindly, but without softness. The captain swallowed, his jaw tightening. "Yes, sir." Meanwhile, the cabin's integrated monitoring system continued its silent work. Every camera lens, whether embedded in a seat panel nestled behind the galley wall or discreetly mounted near the lavatories, was still active. The footage streamed directly to Alton Aerodyne's private compliance servers in real time, and every second of it, every sneer, every insult, every moment of judgment was being documented in perfect clarity. Blake's hands now hung uselessly at his sides. His earlier smirk had vanished, replaced with a slack-jawed vacancy that betrayed the panic beginning to build behind his eyes. Drew, standing just behind him, shifted his weight uncomfortably and averted his gaze. Neither man could find a place to land their pride anymore. There was nowhere left to stand. The irony pressed like gravity upon them. The child they had removed was not merely entitled to the seat, they had removed the very future of the airline, and the man they had spoken over, condescended to, and dismissed wasn't just a customer. He was the architect of their entire world. Cyrus didn't need to say more. His presence alone now carried the weight of the lesson. No shouting, no threats, just consequences looming quietly. One by one, the passengers who had silently observed earlier now stared with widened eyes and lowered phones. Some watched with admiration, some with shame, but none were unaffected. The man who owned the aircraft, the company, the policy manual, had let them all write the story of their downfall in their own ink. "Respect," Cyrus said coldly, his voice low but undeniable as he stared at the trembling attendants, "isn't optional when you fly my skies." The flight attendant claimed it was protocol, blasting the whistle again while mocking the crying infant. The uncle watched in silence until justice had to speak louder. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe now. Justice starts here. The moment the seatbelt sign flickered on, a quiet shift rippled through the cabin of Solanair Flight 417. The descent had begun, but for the crew in first class, the drop wasn't just in altitude, it was the start of a reckoning. Cyrus Alton sat still, his back straight against the plush leather of seat 1B. He didn't glance up as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, delivering routine descent instructions with a noticeable tremor. The voice betrayed more than nerves. It hinted at awareness. Awareness that something had gone wrong, and that the storm wasn't behind them, but directly ahead. Across the aisle, Ethan Calder held a slim, hardcover book in his lap. His small fingers rested lightly on the open page, but he hadn't turned it in several minutes. His eyes flicked upward every few seconds, toward the cabin doors, toward the crew, toward his father. Silence filled the space around them like pressure in a sealed cabin. No words were exchanged, but a current of understanding passed between the boy and the man beside him. Ethan's quiet strength mirrored Cyrus's poise, though the boy's jaw tensed slightly each time a crew member walked past without making eye contact. Near the galley, Blake Soren and Drew Hanley stood in rigid silence. Their earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by anxious stiffness. Blake's arms were folded, but his fingers tapped restlessly against his forearm. Drew kept glancing toward the cockpit, as if waiting for a lifeline from the captain. None came. Then, with deliberate calm, Cyrus lifted his left wrist and tapped twice on the face of his watch. The screen lit with a subtle glow, invisible to most around him. A silent command was issued, a final transmission. The device linked directly to the encrypted internal network of Alton Aerodyne, activating a live file transfer protocol. The footage from every onboard security lens, mounted discreetly above cabin seats, crew zones, and entryways, began streaming in real time to the company's ethics division and media relations team. Miles, seated 2 rows behind under a travel alias, received a subtle vibration on his own watch. He tapped once to confirm the transfer, his expression unreadable. But behind the calm exterior, his mind raced. This was no longer a private investigation. It was an institutional moment of truth. Every second of the crew's behavior toward Ethan had just become evidence. Cyrus leaned slightly toward the aisle, his voice low but firm. "If leadership hides truth," he murmured, "then arrogance repeats itself unchecked." He didn't need to look at Miles. The words were for the air around them, for history to record. Miles nodded almost imperceptibly. Beneath his seat, his bag vibrated with alerts from the compliance team. Messages were already firing off across Alton Aerodyne's senior channels. By the time the aircraft's wheels would meet the runway, vice presidents and regional directors across the continent would be fully briefed. This wasn't just an incident anymore. It was a case study in real time. Outside the aircraft, the city of New Crest stretched out beneath a golden haze. The captain's voice returned, thinner this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be touching down shortly. Weather is clear. We'd like to thank you for flying Solanair." He paused. There was a silence, a beat too long before he added, "And we'd also like to extend a special welcome to our passengers arriving in New Crest City today." The hesitation in his tone was audible to anyone listening closely. He knew. Someone had told him. Perhaps from the ground, perhaps from the whispers in the cockpit. Either way, the weight of what had occurred was sinking in. As the aircraft descended through the clouds, passengers began shifting in their seats. Some stretched, some reached for their bags, but most sat unusually still, casting cautious glances toward the front cabin. They had all seen it unfold. Many had recorded it. A boy being removed, a father unmoved, a revelation in silence. Now, the man they had underestimated sat quiet and calculating, no louder than the engine hum, but infinitely more powerful. Cyrus's gaze remained forward. He had no interest in dramatic gestures or confrontations. This wasn't about anger. It was about something far deeper. Accountability, delivered without fanfare. The damage was already done. Now came the exposure. In 22D, a balding man who had earlier questioned the attendant's actions leaned toward his companion and whispered, "That boy's father owns the airline. They messed with the wrong family." His companion didn't respond. He only nodded slowly, eyes locked on Ethan, who now turned another page in his book with quiet grace. The landing gear lowered with a mechanical groan. The soft, whirring vibrations spread through the cabin floor. Moments later, the aircraft's wheels touched the tarmac with a thud that seemed sharper than usual. The brakes engaged, slowing the massive machine toward its final stop at Gate 9. The captain's voice came one last time, steadier now but still not recovered. "Welcome to New Crest City," he said. A scattered applause followed, uncertain, soft but real. It wasn't just about arrival. It was about relief, respect, recognition of something larger than a flight, of something witnessed that none would forget. Ethan closed his book and looked up at his father. His voice was quiet but sincere. "Will they lose their jobs?" Cyrus looked down, then out the window, as if weighing the answer in the clouds. He finally replied, his tone calm but resolute. "They'll face something more powerful than losing work. They'll face what they tried to ignore. Accountability." The words echoed faintly as the cabin lights shifted to disembarkation mode. The hum of the engines began to fade, but inside that moment, inside that truth, something far greater had just begun. The engines whined to a stop, but the lesson was just beginning. "Landing," Cyrus murmured, "is only the start of descent." The steel doors of the private hangar slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing a long, sterile room illuminated by overhead lights that buzzed faintly like distant insects. The air was cold, unnaturally so, not from temperature alone, but from the thick tension that settled over the space like an invisible frost. 3 figures stepped inside under the watchful gaze of 2 security officers. Blake Soren walked first, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched. Behind him came Drew Hanley, noticeably pale, his eyes darting between corners of the hangar as if searching for an exit. Last was the cabin supervisor, a man in his 50s with thinning gray hair and a hollow expression. None of them spoke. Inside, a semicircle of figures stood waiting: corporate investigators in charcoal suits, legal advisors with tablets in hand, and compliance officers holding clipboards lined with reports. Their expressions were unreadable, their silence more intimidating than any accusation. In the center stood a large screen, black for now, but humming faintly, waiting to play its part. The door at the far end opened again. Cyrus Alton entered without fanfare, his steps deliberate, his face unreadable. He wore a dark overcoat over his tailored suit, one hand in his pocket, the other resting gently on his son's shoulder. Ethan walked beside him, silent, composed, yet clearly absorbing every detail of the moment. Behind them came Miles, carrying a leather-bound case and a neutral expression that concealed the storm brewing within. No greetings were exchanged. Cyrus didn't ask them to sit. He didn't need to. With the mere flick of his finger, Miles activated the monitor, and the screen flared to life. The cabin footage played without sound at first: Blake's smirk, the forced politeness, the subtle grab at Ethan's shoulder, Drew's quiet support, the walk of shame to the back of the plane. Then the volume rose. Ethan's soft voice trembled. "I have a ticket." Blake's dismissive reply followed. "This must be a printing error." Then came the phrase that turned the stomachs of everyone in the hangar. "He doesn't belong here." The footage paused. The screen dimmed. Silence reclaimed the room like a tide. Blake cleared his throat. "We were just following standard procedure," he said, his voice tight, almost rehearsed. His hands remained folded in front of him, but his right foot tapped the floor lightly, betraying his nerves. The child looked out of place. "We couldn't risk." Cyrus slowly turned to face him, his voice soft but iron-edged. "If your procedure justifies humiliation, then your standard is broken." The words landed like a gavel, final and inarguable. Blake flinched. Drew looked down. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, his hands twitching at his sides. Ethan remained still, his eyes locked on the screen as if replaying every second not just in pixels, but in memory. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The door opened once more, and the head of Human Resources entered briskly, carrying a thin file in hand. He handed it to Cyrus and offered a quiet report. "The attendants will face formal disciplinary hearings." The internal report has already begun processing. All necessary documentation has been filed. Cyrus took the file but didn't open it. Instead, he addressed the room again. "No." The single word hung in the air, sharp as a blade. "I don't want this hidden in a folder," he said. "I don't want it buried beneath hearings and procedural summaries." He turned slowly, looking at each of the 3 men in front of him. "This incident will be made public. Every airline under our corporate umbrella will receive this footage. Every new hire, every veteran crew member, every executive." His tone remained calm, but its weight was unbearable. "Let this be a manual on what not to do." Blake's shoulders sagged. Drew's breath caught audibly in his throat. The supervisor finally spoke up, voice strained with desperation. "Sir, we understand our mistake. Is there no room for correction?" Cyrus glanced toward his son before responding. "Correction without reflection is useless. You may correct your words, your posture, your tone, but if you fail to reflect deeply and honestly, then this will happen again. Not to someone like Ethan, but to someone whose name you'll never know he turned to leave." Ethan followed without hesitation, his small hand gripping the strap of his satchel, eyes forward. Miles walked last, nodding once to the compliance officers as they passed. No one moved until the steel door clicked shut behind them. Outside, the air on the tarmac was cool, but carried the scent of jet fuel and ocean wind. Ethan said nothing as they walked toward the private car waiting near the edge of the hangar. Only once they reached the door did he glance up at his father. Cyrus met his gaze with a rare softness in his eyes. "Come," he said gently. "We've done what we came to do." As they pulled away, the hangar receded in the distance, still cold, still silent. Inside, 3 men stood in the long shadow of their choices, now immortalized in the very training manuals they once ignored. And as the car disappeared into the horizon, the words Cyrus had left behind still echoed in the minds of everyone present. "Some flights teach altitude," he said. "Others teach humanity." The video hit the world like a storm. By sunrise, the footage of Ethan Calder being removed from his first-class seat had already racked up over 4 million views. News anchors, morning hosts, and aviation bloggers dissected the clip frame by frame, their voices echoing across offices, airports, and living rooms worldwide. There was no dramatic music or fiery confrontation, just a calm boy in a suit, quietly obeying, and a father who said little, until his name changed everything. The scene of Cyrus Alton standing in silence, revealing his identity without raising his voice, became a symbol of silent power. It wasn't just a corporate scandal anymore. It was personal, it was public, and it was impossible to ignore. Across the aviation industry, executives huddled behind boardroom doors, their eyes fixed on muted televisions displaying the same grainy footage. Ethan clutching the armrest, Blake Soren's smug grin, Drew Hanley nervously justifying, and Cyrus's quiet authority slicing through them like a knife. The words "priority owner class" visible on the boarding pass froze even the most seasoned airline directors. And then came the captain's announcement, his voice stumbling as he publicly thanked the very man whose son had just been dismissed. At Alton Aerodyne's headquarters in Ralden, the main communications office flickered with hundreds of alerts per minute. Miles stood before a massive screen wall, scrolling through statements from partner airlines, reporters, consumer rights groups, and government officials demanding responses. The pressure was immediate and relentless. He stepped into Cyrus's corner office without knocking. Cyrus sat at his desk, a half-full cup of tea steaming beside him, his expression unreadable. "Sir," Miles began, trying to keep his voice steady, "the incident has gone global. News outlets in 5 continents are running it. People are calling it the humbling herd across the skies." Cyrus didn't look up. His fingers gently tapped the side of his cup. "And what do the airlines say?" "They're scrambling," Miles replied. "Every one of them. A few are issuing public apologies, some even before they've confirmed their staff weren't involved. It's panic. Several CEOs are asking if they can quietly adopt our ethics framework before their next board meeting." Now Cyrus looked up, his gaze sharp but not surprised. "Let them. True reform doesn't start with policy. It starts with being seen." He stood slowly, walked over to the tall window, and looked out over the city skyline. Below, cars streamed along the expressway, unaware that a quiet revolution had just taken flight. Across town, in a small apartment lit only by the flicker of a TV screen, Blake Soren sat frozen. His phone buzzed nonstop on the table beside him. News alerts, missed calls, voicemails from colleagues, reporters asking for statements, former co-workers whispering rumors about disciplinary hearings. The broadcast replayed again, the moment Cyrus identified himself. Blake leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at his own reflection in the screen. He looked nothing like the confident flight attendant from the day before. His breath quickened as the video replayed his smirk, his dismissive gesture, his hand gripping the shoulder of a child. His jaw tightened. He rubbed his face, but the shame didn't go away. The same hand that had grabbed Ethan now trembled in his lap, as if it knew what he hadn't, what that action would cost. "Respect," Cyrus's voice said on screen, calm but final, "isn't optional when you fly my skies." Blake closed his eyes, but the words didn't fade. Back at headquarters, Miles walked alongside Cyrus through the central hallway, where staff members turned to nod respectfully as they passed. Several paused in their work to whisper about the story they were now part of. No one raised their voice. No one dared ask for comment. But every glance held the same question. What happens next? Inside the elevator, Miles reviewed his tablet. "Sir, you're being asked to appear on every major network, 3 primetime interviews, 1 international summit, 2 magazine features. Even the Aviation Safety Board wants your insight." Cyrus pressed the button for the executive floor. "Decline them all." Miles blinked. "All of them?" "Yes," Cyrus said simply. "This isn't about me." "But the public wants a statement." "They have one," Cyrus interrupted. He took a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket and handed it to Miles. On it was a single line, handwritten in black ink. "No title should be required to deserve dignity." Miles read the line again and nodded slowly. "Understood." The elevator doors opened. Cyrus stepped out without another word, heading toward his office with the weight of global attention at his back. Meanwhile, in cities from Berlin to Boston, passengers posted their own stories online. One by one, they recounted humiliations long buried, discrimination, profiling, dismissive treatment. Some had video clips. Others had only their words. But every post ended with the same tag, #SeatOfRespect. By noon, the hashtag trended in 29 countries. The shift was undeniable. Consumer groups demanded reviews. Advocacy organizations applauded Alton Airline for transparency. The airline's ethics portal saw over 500,000 new subscribers in less than 6 hours. A quiet child's removal from a seat had cracked open an entire industry's hidden failures. Back in his office, Cyrus stood alone once again. He glanced at the silver pin on his desk, the one engraved with his initials. Ethan had left it there earlier that morning before heading to school, a quiet sign of trust. Cyrus picked it up, turned it over in his palm, and closed his eyes for a moment. The storm had passed, but the skies had changed. When Miles returned to brief him on the next round of media fallout, Cyrus didn't wait for the report. "Respect," he said softly, eyes still on the pin, "isn't restored by silence, it's rebuilt by example." The incident had barely settled when Cyrus Alton convened an emergency executive board session inside Alton Airline's towering headquarters in Rawdon. The room was silent, the kind of silence that followed storms, heavy, reflective, anticipatory. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glinted under a pale sky, unaware that its aviation titan was about to change flight protocol history. Cyrus stood at the head of the long obsidian conference table, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest that this wasn't a performance. He didn't need theatrics. The footage had spoken for itself. "We begin today," he said simply, placing a thick folder labeled Internal Crew Audit Findings on the table. No one dared interrupt as he opened it. Page after page revealed unsettling truths, first-hand passenger complaints ignored, incidents dismissed as misunderstandings, staff promoted despite poor feedback, and a pattern of bias where those with wealth or influence received better treatment than those without. The worst part? Many of these reports had been quietly buried under complex layers of bureaucracy. A young operations lead named Keller tried to defend the delay in processing grievances. "Sir, some of these passengers didn't provide enough detail to escalate." Cyrus cut in with a tone so calm it was almost colder than anger. "They didn't need to. The moment we required them to prove their dignity, we failed." The room stilled. What followed wasn't a sweeping wave of terminations or angry ultimatums. Instead, Cyrus laid out the blueprint for something far more enduring: Project Elevate. The name flashed on the screen behind him as he spoke. "This isn't a punishment system," he explained. "This is a transformation protocol." His voice carried with quiet authority as he detailed the initiative's components. Mandatory empathy training, where crew would engage in immersive simulations placing them in the shoes of passengers from every walk of life. Anonymous passenger assessments conducted digitally within 24 hours of each flight, and real-time cabin monitoring, not to spy, but to document interactions that could train future generations. "There is no growth without reflection," Cyrus said. "We can't correct arrogance with fear, only with awareness." The board members, many of whom had served under him for over a decade, said nothing at first, but Miles, seated closest to Cyrus, leaned forward. "And the implementation timeline?" "Immediate," Cyrus replied. "Every contracted airline, every crew, every flight. No exceptions." By that evening, internal bulletins were dispatched, and contracts were amended to reflect the new mandates. A cultural shift had begun, not just for Alton Aerodyne, but potentially for the industry at large. Meanwhile, in the quiet hours of late afternoon, Ethan sat on the leather couch in his father's private office, watching the skyline with quiet thoughtfulness. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. On Cyrus's desk sat a thick leather-bound journal, its pages half filled with the uneven but thoughtful handwriting of a 12-year-old. He had begun writing the morning after the flight. Not about the embarrassment, not about the looks, but about the moment when his father remained calm while the world misunderstood his worth. "The seat didn't matter," Ethan had written. "What mattered was whether I believed I still belonged." He hadn't asked Cyrus for permission to write it. He just did. And each day after school, he brought his notebook with him to the office, quietly recording his thoughts while executives shuffled outside the glass walls. At first, it had been a private exercise, a son trying to make sense of the storm that had passed. But one afternoon, Miles entered the room while Ethan was writing and glanced at the pages. Later, when they were alone, he pulled Cyrus aside. "Maybe we should keep the boys writing within the family," he suggested gently. "Some things are too personal." Cyrus turned toward the glass where Ethan sat, his pen slowly moving across the page. "No," he said after a long pause, his voice low but resolute. "Let the world see it through a child's eyes. They'll understand faster that way." The next day, Cyrus personally contacted the curriculum team overseeing Alton Aerodyne's new leadership initiative. Ethan's journal would be transcribed, word for word, into the opening module of every training program under Project Elevate. But despite the forward momentum, Cyrus carried something heavier than pride. Each win, each step toward reform, carried with it a memory he couldn't ignore, that of watching his own son walk toward the back of a plane in silence, judged not by his worth but by others' assumptions. Late one night, long after the lights of the boardroom had gone dark, he stood by the massive window in his office, watching aircraft lights blink gently across the horizon. Miles had already left. Ethan was asleep in the spare lounge, journal clutched like armor. Cyrus whispered to the quiet night, not expecting an answer. "Reform," he said, his voice barely audible, "always starts with regret." Blake stood at the far end of the gleaming glass boardroom, his shoulders rigid, hands clasped in front of him to hide their trembling. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished floor, slicing through the room like silent judgment. Outside the towering windows, the city buzzed with the oblivious rhythm of traffic and commerce. Inside, time held its breath. Cyrus Alton entered without announcement. He did not pause, did not sit. He simply walked to the head of the table with a calm that seemed to still the air. His eyes found Blake immediately. There was no anger in them, no satisfaction, only a sharp, unreadable focus that made Blake's throat tighten. "Sir," Blake began, voice cracking. He tried again, clearing his throat. "Sir, I came to apologize." He looked up, only to be met with silence. He faltered, forcing the words out like a confession. "I let pride replace compassion. I thought I was protecting policy, but really, I was protecting my ego." I see that now Cyrus didn't move. The quiet was heavier than any rebuke. Blake shifted uneasily, the echo of his own voice still hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. For a moment he considered whether this meeting had been a mistake. Perhaps he would have been better off simply resigning. But he stayed, because something in him needed to face this. After a long silence, Cyrus finally spoke. "Regret," he said, "is easy." Blake's chest tightened. Cyrus took a step forward. "Change," he continued, "is harder." From a folder on the table, he pulled a single document and slid it across the surface toward Blake. It stopped exactly in front of him. The bold header read, "Instructor Placement Offer, Empathy and Service Integrity Program." Blake stared at it, confused, uncertain. "You want me to teach?" he asked, blinking as if the words themselves didn't make sense. Cyrus nodded once. "Yes, you'll lead new recruits in empathy seminars. You'll be supervised, closely. And the footage from Flight 417, your actions, your words, will be the first module. Every lesson begins with your failure." Blake felt his face burn. The shame returned, twisting in his gut. But there was something else, too, an unfamiliar flicker of hope. "You want me to relive it? Over and over?" "No," Cyrus said. "I want you to rebuild from it. If you can teach others never to repeat your mistakes, perhaps you'll reclaim your own dignity in the process." Blake's hands trembled as he picked up the document. It felt heavier than it should. He blinked fast, fighting the sting in his eyes, but a tear broke free and slid down his cheek anyway. "I don't deserve this chance," he whispered. "No," Cyrus said, "but what you do with it may prove whether you've earned something more important than a second chance, self-awareness." At the far end of the boardroom, near the window overlooking the skyline, Ethan stood quietly. The boy had said nothing throughout the meeting, yet his presence was a reminder of the moment that started it all, of the dignity stolen and then restored not by force, but by example. Blake glanced at him, and the boy nodded, not out of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. The gesture struck deeper than any word. After the meeting, as the door slid open and Cyrus prepared to leave, Ethan turned to his father. "Why forgive him?" he asked, his voice soft but clear. Cyrus paused. The light from the setting sun caught the edge of his blazer, casting a golden silhouette around him. He looked at his son and answered quietly, "Because power without mercy becomes tyranny. And tyranny has no altitude." The first row of executives stared up at the stage as if they were witnessing something impossible. A boy, barely 13, stood in front of the most powerful aviation leaders in the world. He adjusted the microphone once, hesitated, then looked down at the note card, trembling in his fingers. From the side of the auditorium, Cyrus Alton watched his son in silence, arms folded tightly across his chest, his expression unreadable. The backdrop of the Global Aviation Summit loomed behind Ethan, a wall of lights, cameras, and anticipation. The room was cavernous, filled with high-backed chairs, glass nameplates, and polished shoes. But none of that mattered. All eyes were locked on the boy who had once been humiliated in seat 1A, now standing at the apex of reform. Ethan cleared his throat. "My name is Ethan Calder," he began, his voice quiet but steady. My father owns planes, but what matters isn't ownership. It's how we treat those who sit beside us." There was a pause that grew heavy with meaning. "I learned that the hard way," he continued, "because once I was asked to leave a seat not because I didn't belong there, but because someone believed I didn't look like I should." His eyes swept the room. Men in $1,000 suits leaned forward slightly. Miles, seated in the third row, subtly nodded with pride. "But what happened afterward," Ethan went on, "changed everything. Not just for me, for the company, for the crew, for every passenger who's ever felt unseen. Footage from that infamous flight had been playing on screens across training centers for months, and, alongside it, Ethan's journal entries, scanned in his own handwriting, narrated over quiet music, showing raw reflections like, 'I didn't cry. I wanted to, but I thought if I stayed calm, maybe someone would notice.' That sentence alone had changed how hundreds of flight attendants approached their jobs. But standing in front of an audience this large, this powerful, was another challenge altogether. The summit moderator, a stern-faced executive from Northern Falcon Airlines, had initially questioned allowing a teenager to close the day's schedule. But after the recent overhaul of industry-wide passenger conduct policies and the rising popularity of Alton Aerodyne's Project Elevate, silence had become a risk no airline could afford. Backstage, Blake Soren watched from a corner, his ID badge now bearing the label Training Supervisor, Ethics Division. Months of mandated sessions, grueling reviews, and public accountability had reshaped the very core of who he was. Ethan's words were no longer just a story. They were now curriculum. And Blake knew it had to be that way. Ethan gripped the podium, gaining strength. "My father once told me that the highest seat on a plane doesn't make you better. It just gives you a better view to protect the people behind you." A low hum of agreement passed through the audience. Today, we don't just talk about safety and service. We talk about dignity, respect, and that starts before you ever take off. Suddenly, a tech crew member backstage dropped something metallic. The sharp clink echoed across the hall, but Ethan didn't flinch. The poise he showed reflected not just rehearsal, but resolve. Cyrus's lips parted slightly as though holding back words, but his eyes softened. Ethan finished. "Every seat matters." Because every person does. Silence lingered for just one breath too long, and then the auditorium erupted into applause. Not the kind given out of obligation or habit, but the kind that rises slowly, as realization settles in. Executives stood. Journalists stopped taking notes and just listened. Miles exhaled, deeply moved. Even the moderator, once skeptical, rose and joined the standing ovation. Cyrus didn't move. He just watched. Then, quietly, almost reluctantly, he stepped backstage to meet his son. Ethan emerged a moment later, still holding the note card, now bent slightly at the corners. Cyrus approached slowly, then placed a hand on his son's shoulder. His touch was light, but it carried the weight of everything they'd endured. "You've just taught them something I never could," Cyrus said softly. The boy smiled, blinking under the bright hallway lights. They stepped together into the corridor beyond, away from the noise and the cameras. Outside the glass walls, the sky stretched wide and deep, bathed in hues of fading gold and the first trace of twilight. The wind shifted gently, cool and clean. The sky outside shimmered in the late evening light, calm and endless. "Some flights," Cyrus whispered, "never truly land. They rise into memory." The silver pin gleamed faintly against the soft linen of Ethan's navy shirt, catching a trace of moonlight as he stood at the edge of the terrace. A cool breeze swept across the balcony, carrying with it the distant, hollow rumble of an aircraft engine high above. His eyes followed the blinking lights in the sky. That particular flight, somewhere in the stratosphere, bore the quiet legacy of everything that had happened a year ago. Inside the house, the quiet clack of polished shoes echoed along the marble hallway. Miles approached Cyrus's study with a stack of sealed reports in his arms, his usual precision intact, though a rare flicker of satisfaction danced in his eyes. "Sir," he said, stepping into the warmly lit office where Cyrus sat by the fireplace, scanning a tablet. "The monthly assessments are complete." Cyrus looked up. The flames danced in the glass reflection of his reading lenses. "Good," he said with his usual calm. "Anything unusual?" Miles hesitated just a beat longer than usual, then smiled faintly. "Yes, every new hire across our network, charter, domestic, international, they all watch the footage of that flight. First day." Mandatory Cyrus chuckled under his breath. Not mockery, not pride, just the deep, measured sound of a man watching something he'd planted finally bloom. "Let them remember," he said, standing and buttoning his jacket, "that altitude without humility means nothing." He crossed the room and joined Ethan outside. The terrace stretched over the quiet hillside, bathed in the soft glow of garden lights. In the distance, the lights of Newcrest City twinkled like stardust pinned to the earth. Ethan didn't turn when he heard his father step beside him. He simply pointed to the blinking light in the sky. "That's one of ours," he said softly. Cyrus followed his son's gaze. The plane was nothing more than a distant flicker, but he recognized the signature red-blue tail light, the unmistakable pattern of an Alton Aerodyne long-range executive cruiser. "Yes," Cyrus replied, his voice low and thoughtful, "but it belongs to everyone who flies it with respect." There was a long silence, not uncomfortable but heavy with meaning. Ethan's fingers touched the silver pin near his collar. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "So, what did you learn that day?" Cyrus didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the stars above, his face carved in calm reflection. That day had changed more than policy. It had shaken the foundation of what he once believed leadership required. He breathed in slowly, the scent of trimmed cedar and night jasmine filling his lungs. Then, with the stars glinting faintly in his eyes, he turned toward Ethan and spoke. "That the highest seat on a plane doesn't make you above anyone. It just gives you a better view to protect them." The lights dimmed slightly as the press conference hall buzzed with anticipation. A large screen at the center of the stage flickered to life, displaying a grainy yet unforgettable image, one that had, over the years, grown into a symbol across the global aviation industry. The footage opened to a young boy, barely 12, being quietly escorted out of first class, his expression a mixture of confusion and quiet dignity. The image shifted to the towering figure of his father, calm and unreadable as the boy disappeared past the curtain. The crowd, a mix of executives, press, and aviation insiders, fell utterly silent. The atmosphere felt reverent, like a courtroom watching the final moments of a long trial. Though the clip was barely 30 seconds long, it hit with the weight of a decade's transformation. This wasn't just company history, it was a cultural turning point. As the screen faded to black, the spotlight found Ethan Calder standing alone at center stage. Now 25, Ethan bore the poise of a seasoned executive, yet his eyes still carried the soft steadiness of the boy in that video. He wore a tailored gray suit with a silver pin glinting against his lapel, those same initials, CA, etched clearly in remembrance of the man who had raised him not only with wealth, but with wisdom. He stepped forward slowly, allowing the silence to linger before he spoke. "That day," he began, his voice calm but resonant, "taught me the difference between authority and integrity." He paused, letting the words settle over the room like a wave. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled. "My father didn't just build planes," Ethan continued, scanning the audience, his gaze unwavering. "He built a culture of accountability, a culture where dignity isn't offered based on title, clothing, or seat number, but where it's non-negotiable. Every seat matters." The crowd erupted into applause, loud, sustained, and laced with something deeper than admiration. It was respect. As the clapping died down, Ethan gave a slight nod of thanks and stepped back from the podium. His speech had been short, but deliberate. Every word chosen like a brick laid carefully into the foundation of legacy. Behind the wings of the stage, hidden from most eyes, stood Cyrus Alton. Older now, with silver streaks in his once black hair, Cyrus leaned slightly on his cane, not from weakness but from age earned with integrity. His presence still carried gravity. His gaze followed Ethan with pride not displayed in words, but in the faint shimmer at the corner of his eyes. When Ethan exited the stage, he walked straight toward his father. No cameras captured this moment, no microphones recorded it, but it was the moment that mattered most. "You flew higher than I ever did," Cyrus said softly, his voice low, touched by emotion, yet composed. Ethan looked at him for a long moment before answering, his voice just above a whisper. "You gave me the wings, Father." For a heartbeat, time stood still between them. The applause continued behind them, now just an echo as the father and son stood together at the edge of legacy and future. The lights of the stage dimmed once more as a distant jet hummed across the skyline outside the conference hall. One of theirs, no doubt, crossing continents on wings designed by a man who taught the world that respect belonged to all who soared. "Some flights," Ethan said, echoing his father's words, "never end. They just ascend." The lights dimmed one by one until only the faint glow from the massive screen remained. Ethan stood at the center of the empty auditorium, his reflection mirrored faintly on the polished floor. On the screen behind him, the old footage played in silence, the moment that had haunted him for years. A boy, no older than 7, clutching a silver pin as uniformed attendants escorted him from first class. His eyes wide, his lips trembling, confusion and shame blending in a way that never truly left him. Ethan stared at that child, frozen in time, and felt the same ache that had once defined his every decision. The world had changed since then. Laws rewritten, companies reformed, and industries forced to confront their prejudice. But for him, the moment never stopped replaying. Now, for the first time, he realized it wasn't about reliving the pain. It was about understanding what had grown from it. The door creaked softly. Miles stepped in, his polished shoes echoing lightly against the wooden floor. Once his father's closest aide, now the company's chief operations officer, Miles carried an air of calm authority mixed with the exhaustion of a man who had spent decades rebuilding something broken. "You know," he began quietly, walking up the aisle, "your father never watched that video again after the reforms began." Ethan turned toward him, brow furrowing. "Why not?" Miles stopped beside him, the flickering light from the screen casting shifting shadows across his lined face. "He said the lesson was already learned," Miles replied, voice steady but soft. "He didn't need to relive it." Ethan looked back at the boy on the screen, the tiny hand clutching that silver pin. His father had given it to him before that flight, an emblem of courage. "He always knew how to move forward," Ethan murmured. Miles nodded. "He turned anger into architecture." That's what he used to say. "Build systems, not grudges. That's how change lasts." The words settled between them, heavy and true. Ethan took a slow breath. The air smelled faintly of dust and ozone from the overhead lights cooling down. "Sometimes," Ethan said half to himself, "I think he carried that memory so I wouldn't have to." Miles smiled faintly. "Then make sure you carry what he built." They stood in silence for a long moment. The screen dimmed completely, plunging the room into a muted darkness that hummed with memory. When Miles left, his footsteps faded until only the quiet hum of the ventilation system filled the air. Ethan remained still, as if tethered to that space by something deeper than nostalgia, a duty, an inheritance. Later that evening, he walked through the company's training center. The corridors were lined with portraits, faces of employees from every background, captured mid-laughter, mid-learning, mid-change. The low hum of machines from the nearby innovation lab echoed faintly through the hall. Every corner of the building pulsed with quiet energy, as if the walls themselves carried the rhythm of progress. He passed through a wide glass door into the main atrium. The soft overhead lighting illuminated the centerpiece, a framed bronze plaque mounted above a fountain. Its engraving caught the light in thin streaks. Project Elevate, born from respect. Ethan stopped in front of it, his reflection shimmering across the plaque's polished surface. His fingers reached out, tracing the letters carefully, feeling the grooves of each word like the scars of a history that could not be erased. Behind him, a group of trainees passed by, their voices low, filled with hope and ambition. One of them carried a silver pin, just like his. For a brief moment, he saw himself again as that child on the screen, small and frightened, unaware that the humiliation he endured would someday become the foundation of an entire movement. The irony of it struck him. The same injustice that broke him had taught the world to bend toward empathy. He stood there for several minutes, absorbing the sound of footsteps, the faint murmur of laughter, the distant hum of the building that now existed because his father had refused to let bitterness win. His throat tightened, but not from grief. It was gratitude, raw and profound. Outside, through the tall windows, the night stretched wide and calm. City lights shimmered like distant constellations, mirroring the quiet determination that had carried his family through years of struggle. The silver pin on his lapel caught a glint from the overhead light, a small, shining reminder of where he had come from. He thought of all the men who had been silenced, ignored, or underestimated. Men who had been told they didn't belong, yet built futures that proved otherwise. His father had been one of them. Now it was his turn to lead, not with bitterness, but with purpose. Ethan leaned closer to the plaque and whispered, his voice barely more than breath yet filled with conviction. "Sometimes," he said, "the smallest injustice can teach the world to stand taller." The applause was still echoing in his ears when Ethan Rayner stepped off the gilded stage of the Ralden International Civic Forum, his hands still tingling from the weight of the Crystal Humanitarian Award. Cameras flashed, dignitaries offered handshakes, and a former prime minister clasped him on the shoulder with a knowing nod. But the moment that carved itself deepest into Ethan's memory wasn't the roar of celebration. It was what the host said as he handed him the award. "You've redefined flight," the retired pilot had said, his voice seasoned with decades of skybound wisdom. "Not in altitude, but in attitude." The audience had laughed, a warm, full-hearted laugh, and the applause that followed felt like an embrace. Ethan had managed a smile, genuine but distant, already drifting in thought as he nodded in thanks. His speech was brief, sincere, and filled with gratitude. But deep inside, he couldn't wait for it to be over. Later that night, the city was quiet, cloaked in a silver fog that blurred the skyline like watercolor. Ethan's car moved silently through the streets, tinted windows hiding his tired gaze as the award ceremony faded behind him. His phone buzzed with messages, congratulatory notes, media requests, board members wanting statements, but he ignored them all. Home. That was the only destination that mattered. The balcony door was ajar when he stepped inside the penthouse, the air carrying the crisp scent of rain and aviation fuel. And there, seated beneath a dim garden light that illuminated his silvered hair, was Cyrus Rayner, his father, the architect of the dream Ethan had inherited, molded, and, some would say, perfected. Cyrus didn't turn when Ethan approached. He didn't need to. He simply exhaled, his breath curling into the air like vapor trails. The city lights flickered in his glasses, painting him with the glow of their shared legacy. Ethan took the seat beside him without a word. The silence was not awkward. It was sacred. "You did what I hoped," Cyrus said finally, voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly would break something fragile. "You made the sky safer, not just for travelers, but for conscience." Ethan swallowed, the weight of years pressing on his chest. All the battles, the accusations, the endless nights in boardrooms arguing for transparency, for equity, the resistance from old guard investors, the threats, the lawsuits, the journalists digging for scandal. All of it had led to this moment, a quiet affirmation from the one man whose approval had always mattered most. He turned his head slowly, studying his father's face. The once sharp lines of Cyrus's jaw had softened, but the fire in his eyes still burned, undimmed by age or time. "It wasn't easy," Ethan murmured. "Changing a machine that big, it fought back." "But you didn't stop," Cyrus said. "You pushed through." "You led with truth." They sat in silence again, only the faint hum of air traffic far above and the buzz of distant neon breaking the stillness. A glint moved across the sky, a jet, sleek and ghostly under the moonlight, its underbelly catching the city's reflection. Ethan nodded toward it. "That's one of ours." Cyrus followed his gaze. His mouth tugged into a faint smile. "It always will be, because as long as people fly with respect, we'll never come down." Ethan leaned back, letting the night settle around him like a blanket. He closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in quiet contentment. The battles were behind him now, but the mission lived on, etched into every fuselage, every policy, every young engineer who walked into Alton Airdyne with purpose. He opened his eyes again and looked toward the stars, the sky above them vast, endless, and open. "Some flights," Ethan said, "don't end in landing, they end in legacy." He thought noise made him powerful. Seconds later, that same whistle was lodged in his throat. If you stand for dignity, justice, and accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of racism, prejudice, and the poetic justice that follows when bias meets truth. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire empathy, equality, and accountability in the face of discrimination.